Malia, how do you go from good to great?
For me, that really boils down to effort, and not just effort in the moment, but sustained effort over time. Resilience, especially because a lot of times it's hard to put in effort consistently over time. It's hard to put yourself out there. It's really vulnerable to be doing anything at the limit of your ability, to be 100% comfortable with failure, to put that try hard face on, and to know that you could be doing your absolute most and still not reach your goals, whether that be in training, in practice, or outdoors. So I think effort, I think resilience, being able to do that time and time again, being able to put yourself out there and be vulnerable time and time again, that and a little bit what we were talking before, scrappiness. I think that the best people know that the first time you do anything, it's not going to look beautiful. It's not going to look perfect. Kind of abandoning the need for perfection and being willing to do whatever it takes in a given moment. You can always go back, you can always do it again, you can always do it better, you can always do it cleaner. I think it's showing up, I think it's putting everything you have out there and knowing that it doesn't have to look perfect, but that is a necessary step on the path to greatness.
Melina Costanza, welcome to the Testpiece podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Malia, I am psyched to chat with you, but I do want to put out a quick disclaimer, and that's if anyone hears loud explosions in the background, it's because there are loud explosions in the background. There are literal bombs going off in your city right now. Is everything okay over there?
Everything is good. Yeah, the during our chat before the podcast, we were interrupted. I mean, I kind of steamrolled right through. I was so in the zone, but there are, I guess, bomb tests happening in the vicinity. So yeah, people have been a little bit concerned, but now that we know what it is, we can just it's all just a test.
Totally normal, just
Totally
bombs.
normal.
Totally okay. Yeah, you're in Salt Lake City. I'm pretty sure not a lot of bombs normally being blown up there, but it won't stop us. And so let's just get into it. I'm going to give you a quick little intro. You've won nationals in some capacity 8 times, eight. Sometimes in youth, sometimes in collegiate, sometimes in open, sometimes in lead, sometimes in bouldering, and sometimes both of them at the same time, like last year, which is really incredible. First time, maybe luck. Second time, maybe luck. But 8 times, probably not luck. You've also bouldered up to V13 outdoors, even though you told me very clearly last time we chatted that you quote unquote don't like nature. Uh, we'll talk more
Yes.
about indoors versus outdoors later. And the last thing I wanted to throw in, which is probably only impressive to someone like me, is that you have an undergrad degree in physics as well. And now that may not be climbing related, but it's notable because physics majors are known to have the highest IQ, which may explain why you've been so articulate and insightful whenever you show up and do these media things. So that's my intro. Let's drop some bombs, Malia. Let's go for it.
Yes, sir. Well, thank you for the intro. And yeah, physics, maybe not impressive to everyone, but that is the hardest thing I have ever done in my entire life is get through that undergraduate degree. So yeah, let's get right into it.
Yeah, I told you I came in as a physics major and then I took no physics courses. So I it was so hard I didn't want to tackle it. But I'm glad that you are done with the physics degree and back in just all things climbing, even though you do have a normal day job. But wait, sorry, let's not get into the normal day job. That's not why we're here. Uh, Malia, you are an extremely excellent comp climber and something you've pursued really your whole climbing career. And, I just showed all that success you had in it. And I love comp climbing. I love the performance aspect. But what is it for you that really drew you to comp climbing? Like what makes it so special?
Uh, Comp climbing is basically, not everyone can relate to this, but it was how I was introduced to climbing. Before I even knew there was outdoor climbing, I knew there was comp climbing. And I think maybe that's true about a lot of people who join a youth competitive team, people who are young and they see the Olympics for the first time, which is kind of new and exciting that people are getting exposure through so many more avenues. But Yeah, I didn't really know that outdoor climbing existed. I went to a gym for a birthday party, and then I went back and I went to an after school program, and then I was roped in slowly but surely at 8, I believe, into competition climbing, and I just completely fell in love with it. And yeah, the rest is history. I have been comp climbing for as long as I can remember, honestly, at this point. It is pretty remarkable to think that there was even a time before it.
This like classic thing of starting a birthday party, and then the birthday party gets all these kids to like join the team, and then the team kids like flash your projects, and like it's always been kind of like a joke, like, oh, like, those kids at the birthday parties. But what's funny is it's always been a joke, and now those kids are now men and women who are winning Olympics and climbing whatever, 5:15. Like, it's like it was always a joke, and now it's just like, oh, the joke's on everyone else now. So nothing wrong with starting a birthday party. I basically did the same thing, but something that we talked about before that I thought it's just it's this interesting thing where kids have kind of dominated, especially in the US. It just seems like every year the people who are winning are younger and younger. And I mean, you're not too old yourself, Malia, but what do you think about why have kids dominated so much in the past, I don't know, 10 years, 15 years, whatever you want to call it?
Yeah, I mean, funny little anecdote. I was at a competition a week and a half ago in a North America Cup competition, so relatively large scale. And in the semifinal, the MC made an announcement over the loudspeaker that in the women's semifinal, there was only one competitor born pre 2000, and that was me. I was the only one. I was the only one. And that's kind of a wild concept. Pre 2000, and I definitely don't feel old, but I mean, the culture of climbing, being a relatively new sport, being relatively young, especially when it comes to competition climbing, and especially when it comes to Olympic level or competitions of kind of that caliber and that level of recognition, it is relatively young. And I think that has lent itself toward a younger population being successful just because it's constantly changing. There's constant evolution. When you look at sports such as tennis, for example, they've been around for so much longer that, yeah, you've seen, I mean, they went from the wooden rackets to the metal rackets, and there have been technological advancements, there have been differentiations in playing style across eras, but it definitely isn't changing at the rate that climbing is, or that comp climbing specifically is. So with that change, kind of lends itself toward a younger audience, because as kids are being introduced to climbing nowadays, when a kid goes to the gym, they're trying these parkour like movements. Competition style is it's really deviated from grab, crimp, pull, left, right. It has very complex movement that requires a lot of thought. And a lot of times, if you haven't been exposed to that, especially at a young age, it's hard to see a movement from the ground, even to recognize it, what it means, and then to execute, because maybe you haven't had as much experience on that, or even if you have, it wasn't how you were introduced to climbing and it feels like such a departure. So like we were talking about, there is an element of kids have a higher amount of mental plasticity. They learn things more quickly, for example, than adults do, and that just is a scientific fact. However, from my experience, when you look at older competitors, a lot of the times they're very resistant to change. And I know that kind of gets into the whole like crag dad mentality, the whole I hate change and I don't like the way that it's going. And that is true. And that is totally a valid point. I mean, if you went into a sport enjoying it for certain qualities and it completely deviates from those, I mean, I understand being frustrated, but the older competitors, a lot of times, I think, are so resistant to change that it kind of inhibits their capacity for learning and for growth, and they have to accept that there's going to be a lot of failure in the beginning. And when you look at a kid learning to walk for the first time, they're not worried about what if I fall down. It just is kind of a natural, very innocent learning process. And I think one of the reasons why it's so hard for older people to adapt to the changes is because their mindset is already kind of maybe negative, or even just afraid of the change. And there's so many ways that so many factors and that we kind of get in our own ways.
Yeah, a closed mind isn't doing anyone any favors. And I'm just wondering, because you were really just deeply in that comp scene during all these changes, was it really obvious to you what changes were coming? And also, the kind of next question to that is, what changes do you see in the near future?
Yeah, I think that it has been obvious to a degree. We I can pick up on a trajectory, right? So we've been seeing these parkour like movements, complex movements, coordination gradually being introduced. And when you do a paddle with one hold, your instant reaction is, what if next year there's a paddle between two holds? And then what if suddenly there are all you have to jump down onto a volume and then jump back up and then paddle? Like, there are ways that the movements that you've seen can be kind of, there can be an amalgamation, I guess, of the movements. But there are some things, for example, the clear flat holds, the shiny clear holds that were introduced maybe a year and a half ago at World Champs, that, or maybe that was only 1 year, gosh, it is, there are things you can't really conceptualize, right? And you always have to be prepared when you enter a competition environment that there could be something completely novel, something that you've never seen before, and you just have to figure it out on the fly. So you understand the trajectory, but not necessarily the individual new elements. But that is also what makes climbing so cool, is that you have the opportunity to problem solve something potentially completely novel. And not a lot of sports have that. Well, at least not in my experience.
Yeah, I like that thing you're saying where, I mean, if we started seeing volumes, it's not a big surprise that we saw bigger volumes. And when we saw, like, yeah, a paddle dyno, it's like, what about a double paddle dyno? And so it's probably kind of clear in hindsight, but I don't know, like for some reason, when you're not used to these new things, it kind of can break your brain. It's like hard to see what's coming. Uh, I gotta ask about these clear holds. Like I've never climbed on them. I just assume they're looking to put cameras in them, but is there something else about climbing on them? Like, does it make it harder to find where the good spot is, or somehow make like dead pointing more difficult to them? Like, what's it like climbing on those?
I really like what you said about cameras because that would be really interesting. Put a GoPro or something
I
inside
think
one of
they do
those
it.
and
I think it's been done.
wow. Huh, that is clever. That is clever. I've definitely seen some weird things be screwed into those, like tennis shoes and rubber chickens, and you can do a lot with them. You can be creative, but what makes it so difficult to grab them, when you've climbed on a dual text hold, you know the different texture. There's one side, for example, that is a lot rougher, like a normal climbing hold texture, and one side that's plastic. But even that plastic, you can kind of get a little purchase. I feel that if you step on it, as long as you kind of are aware of your forces, not to get into physics, but the normal force against the shiny plastic, you can get some purchase. Whereas with the new flat holds, the shiny clear flat holds, it seems that the whole material is different and it is much, much more slippery. So you really have to be very precise about trying to stop all your momentum when, like you're saying, at a dead point. It has to be the absolute apex of your movement where you have virtually no momentum when you're hitting it. Otherwise, you're kind of shooting off in whatever direction you came into it. And that has posed a very different challenge, also because of access, right? Because you can only train with the materials that you're given. And those holds are probably, I imagine, very expensive and hard to come by because they're relatively new. And there's been drama about what teams have had access to them prior to World Cups, and I don't know. They're very, very interesting. Some people have been spitting on their hands before grabbing them just to make it try and increase the stickiness. But yeah, they're weird. They're really weird and they're fun and they're new, but they are hard to hold on to, harder than you'd probably imagine.
I love this cat and mouse game that the setters are always playing. It's like, oh, have you seen this? Like surprise, and it's a little bit like that where you have to figure it out on the fly. But it makes me think of something you said when we were last chatting about this concept of, you hazarded a guess that maybe it's every person in the finals is physically capable of doing all the boulders, but that's not what happens. Clearly, not it, well. Hopefully, in a well set finals, not everyone does all the boulders. So, what does that just say about what competition is like? That we're presented with new challenges, and probably all of the competitors are physically capable, theoretically, over a course of time. Yeah, what does that say about what competition really is like?
I think that says a lot because yeah, I personally believe, and this isn't true in every case, but for the majority of the time, I think every competitor who qualifies for a final is physically capable of doing every boulder in the round, over a long duration, maybe without the pressure of the audience, maybe without the pressure of time. But what makes that so interesting when you think about it is that there are other factors aside from the physical. Obviously, you need to be at a physical level where you can do them to even be competitive. But once you're at that physical level, there are so many other factors that play into your performance as a competition climber. And the majority of them are mental and technical. So, how well can you read a route from the ground? Then, how well can you execute the movements that you've read from the ground? How well are you able to visualize and then actualize? But then, on top of that, how do you deal with the pressure of the environment? How do you deal with the time pressure? Are you cool under pressure? When you fall, what do you think about? Are you frantic or are you composed? How hard are you willing to try in the heat of the moment? How much are you willing to fail to ultimately succeed? There are just so many ways that you can differentiate yourself from your competitors that are not physical at all. And I think that it was from tennis again. I know I'm going back to it, but it was, I think, Djokovic once said that the top 100 seeded male tennis players were all pretty similar in terms of physical capability, and that the biggest differentiating factor was mindset, especially mindset under pressure, which I found, I mean, I remember it having read it years ago. And I think that it is so appropriate in climbing and probably so appropriate in all competitive sports.
Something else that you said to me that really stuck out is that each competition requires a different mindset. And so even when you think you have it licked, maybe you don't because you were the underdog and you performed really well and you just figured out the mindset to adopt in that point. Then you were the top dog and all of a sudden there was expectations and pressure and what you did before didn't work. So my question is, how did you first find the correct mind or mental state to actualize your physical ability in the first place? And then how have you continued to maintain that and adjust it throughout the years?
Yeah, man, that it really does change. It really does change every single time, but that is what keeps it so interesting. And when I was younger, I had a really hard time. I think it kind of boils down to confidence, but I had a hard time showing up at competitions and showing what I had to give. Every single time it felt like I was kind of underperforming, that I would freeze up in the moment. And what I realized with in retrospect years later is that every single competition I signed up for, I dreaded. I hoped that it would be canceled. I hoped that I would even, this sounds dramatic, but I hoped that I'd get injured beforehand and that I wouldn't have to compete because then it would give me an excuse and then I wouldn't have to do it and that wouldn't reflect poorly on me. There were just so many thoughts going on in my head. And ultimately, I wish I could go back in time and pull myself aside and say, why are you doing it? If you don't want to be doing it, why would you sign up for the comp? What's the point of registering for something that is bringing you so much distress? And at this point in my career, I don't sign up for things that I don't want to do. And I'm really honest with myself about that. And sometimes I've gotten better at differentiating, am I just nervous or do I actually not want to do the competition? And previously it was I didn't want to do it and I kind of tricked myself because I would sometimes have good performances, or I guess I would classify them as good, but is it really a good performance if you're not showing what you have to give? Just because you get a certain placement doesn't necessarily make it a good performance. And I've learned to differentiate that as well with time and experience. But when I came back to competition after a couple of years of a break, I came back because I missed it. And I think that the break was really healthy for me. I wanted to compete, not because I wanted to get a certain placement or because I thought it was expected of me, but because I missed the environment. I missed the pressure. I missed the flow that you can get in the heat of competition. I missed my competitors. There were so many reasons that didn't have anything to do with placement, didn't have anything to do with results, didn't have anything to do with expectations. Um, and what that taught me is that all of that is mental, regardless of your physical capability. If you're not going into it with the right mindset, you're never going to be, I mean, I use the term successful very loosely, but what I kind of determine to be success at this point is, am I able to find that flow state? Am I able to execute? And do I feel proud of the climb I gave independent of results? And if I'm not in a mental place to be able to do that because I genuinely don't want to be there or I'm afraid of failure, then I'm not going to, regardless of how I place, it won't be a successful competition for me. So those are the things that I've worked the hardest to try and control. And yeah, over time it has changed. I came back to do my first competitive season 2021 to 22, and I mean, this might come across as arrogant, but I won pretty much every single competition I competed in for that season up through US team trials. And what I'm remembering now is that I put a ton of time into my mindset practice, into my mental training, more so than maybe I even put on wall. And now going into this upcoming competition season, I feel like I've had nothing but underperformances on paper this season, which is funny because I feel like physically I'm in a better state than I've ever been. But going back to what we were saying just a couple minutes ago, physical versus mental, I mean, at this point, the only thing that's holding me back is myself. And that's a cool place to be in because I have been really, really excellent in terms of mental training, in terms of mental preparation before. And the environment is just different for me now and I have to adapt to it, which is cool. And it can be daunting, but just because I've been good at something before doesn't necessarily guarantee that I'm going to excel in every environment. And I'm having to learn and having to adapt, which has been really fun for me.
This reframing you're doing, where you're saying that I have to, I have to get better, I have to adapt so that I'm going to succeed in this next competition, and versus that idea of dreading competitions and this idea that's like a fun challenge. How does someone know? How do I know when my nerves are just nerves and I'm excited versus like I shouldn't be doing this? You said that earlier, how you there's a difference between not wanting to do something and just being a little nervous. But I want to dig into that a little bit more because it's easy to gloss over that and just be like, yeah, like I didn't want to do that. But how do you understand that honesty inside yourself of, no, I'm just nervous because this is a big challenge. And of course, like it can be intimidating versus this is wrong for me.
Yeah, man, that took me a really, really long time. And that's something where you have to get really introspective. It's not going to be the same answer for everyone, but for me, it came down to a lot of journaling, a lot of meditation, a lot of just sitting with myself and with my thoughts, or trying to kind of remove my thoughts and just feel what my body was feeling, what my body was trying to tell me. And all of that might sound a little bit woo woo to some people, and I get it. I haven't always really understood or partaken in those more meditative practices, but it's helped me a lot to just be more in touch with myself. And I think when we're surrounded by so many different sources of stimulation in our day to day lives, it's easy to kind of ignore what your own body and your own brain are trying to communicate with you, when we're able to drown it out with all these other sources of media or entertainment or anything really. And yeah, for me, it was kind of getting rid of all those vices, just being quiet and reflective and thinking to myself, what about this competition is making me, is giving me these anxieties or reservations? And one of the biggest competitions where I had to address this recently was last year's national championship. A couple weeks out, I didn't feel prepared. And also, I was coming off of a season where I didn't compete for mental and physical health reasons. And I was really, really nervous to the point of making myself physically sick. And I weeks out from the competition, I wanted to withdraw. I talked to my partner Alex about it for a while, and then I just sat with myself and I kind of went through what about this competition is within my control, what is outside of my control, what do I want from it, and is that only placement? And at the end of the day, I realized that I had something to prove to myself. I had to prove to myself that I could go through an experience that was pretty traumatic for me, and regardless of placement, that I could compete and I could do it with the right intentions and that I could do it with the right sort of preparation and I could adhere to my values. And there are so many things that I think spoke to myself more as a person and as an athlete than just as someone who wins competitions. And I wanted to, I guess, expand my narrative and make myself more of a holistic person. And it just, it, it spoke to me. Just taking that quiet time made me realize that there were so many deeper reasons why I wanted to compete. And it's hard to come to that decision and it's hard to know. And sometimes you get it wrong, but that just kind of comes with experience and with time.
I find it really interesting how we're talking about competition, which is by definition you against others. And like you just started talking about, I had to sit with myself. I had to, you know, check out my feelings. I had to rise to this challenge because I had these narratives inside me that said X, Y, and Z. And Malia, then you won bouldering and lead. So okay, good job.
Yeah. Thanks.
And, and it's just it's the reason why it's interesting is it's the exact example of going out and doing your best and then letting the chips fall where they may. And I guess like how do you square that with like winning and wanting to win? Like because I feel like I feel like it's not always right, or maybe I'm putting words in your mouth. My hunch is that there is still a competitive aspect in you that you want to win, but then you also like want to the most important part and the thing that gives you the best chance is to do your best. And so like how does this all follow? Like how do you think about results and how much do they mean to you even though it seems like you're still fundamentally driven by showing up being the best climber you can be on that day?
Yeah. It is so hard. It is so hard, and that's a balance I'm trying to strike right now because yeah, you want to win, everyone wants to win. It if you deny that, you're probably just burying your head in the sand because it just is universally enjoyed. But yeah, at the end of the day, you have to be able to step away from it, even if at the surface level that is what you want. Can you find that quiet space during a competition? Are you able to continue to pull yourself back to the present moment? And it's natural that sometimes your attention kind of slips. It's natural that sometimes your attention kind of flits to the future or to the past. You can't force your brain to do something or pretend like those thoughts don't exist because I don't know. I found that personally to be really futile because it just those thoughts are there. Sometimes they emerge. For me, it really is about can you recenter yourself? When you're having those thoughts, are you able to take a deep breath, focus on the task at hand, and let those thoughts go? And that comes during preparation for a competition, that comes while you're on the wall and training, that comes in the ISO beforehand, or even in the morning eating breakfast. There are a million times when you can allow those thoughts to kind of enter your atmosphere and sometimes they come in and sometimes it's against your control, but can you find that quiet space inside yourself? Can you let it go?
Can we get super nitty gritty example based on this? Because I find that really interesting, and I think everyone understands the idea of kind of intrusive thoughts. So you're on finals boulder number 4. You maybe have a hunch that if you top this, you're gonna win. I don't remember the comp and know what position you were in at that, or if it was a epic finish there. But like you're there, maybe you slip on the first hold and you go like, oh crap, like this is actually hard. Like, oh my gosh, I'm out of the flow. Oh my gosh, if I don't do this, I'm not gonna win. Oh my gosh, I was building up to this. Like, all of a sudden you get knocked out of that and you have these maybe even you now all of a sudden feel that crowd behind you looking at you, watching you. Like I know you said you focus on the task at hand. Like, what does that really mean? Like, what do you do in those moments? Because I have a hunch you've had them before.
I have had them before, and I've really crumbled in those moments before. In 2021 nationals, which was when I won my first open national championship in bouldering on boulder 4, I didn't know whether I knew if I topped it I would secure a win. I didn't know, I knew it would come down to attempts if I didn't. And I really, really crumbled under that pressure. It was a boulder that I could have topped, maybe should have topped, and I just seized up. I got tense. I started looking at the clock. I started looking in the audience. And yeah, sometimes those intrusive thoughts win, but that also is all that's also where you learn the most, I think. I mean, the fact that I still remember this moment so vividly shows that I learned a great deal from that. And yeah, maybe I won the competition at the end of the day, but I kind of lost the internal battle inside my head. There were things that I didn't do as well as I would have liked to. And yeah, I'm not going to say that I feel like I lost the competition, but I do feel like there were really key takeaways that had I had a perfect round, maybe I wouldn't have, I don't know, maybe I wouldn't have learned. And I also feel like I have had opportunities since then to kind of get redemption from that moment. And there have been moments when I knew maybe or had a hunch that a climb would be really pivotal in my placement in a competition. But what I've learned is that I really have to have a very true reason for needing to top a climb, and it can't have anything to do with placement. And maybe I want to top for placement too, but there has to be another reason. It has to be a bigger driving factor. And maybe I have to create that. Maybe I have to fabricate it in my mind. Maybe I have to tell myself that, like, in competitions, I've had to get mad. I've had to create reasons to get mad. I know Michael Jordan has said something about that before, kind of creating false slights against him from other players. And it isn't me versus anyone else. That's not really how I operate. But I have to create something that makes me mad. I have to pretend maybe that people don't think I could do something, or maybe that there is a I didn't do the steep boulder in semifinals, so I have to do the steep boulder in finals to prove to myself that I can do the steep boulder, that the training was working. And there are so many ways that you have to almost trick yourself. You have to get in your own head and you have to create narratives that incentivize you. And sometimes it can look a little silly and sometimes it can feel a little dumb if you let it, but those are the ways that I incentivize myself to get to the top and to grab the finish hold, regardless of the placement, regardless of anything else, because I feel like I have to do it. I feel like I have to avenge something or prove something, or there is a reason that is very, very deep in my heart that is stronger than any placement related or results oriented approach. And I have to create something that's more meaningful to me than any of that.
That's really that's a really interesting practice there. I I think I get it. I think I've done that before, but not on a national stage because I don't get to hang out there too much. But I often will try to come up with reasons to motivate myself when I'm by myself that seem kind of ridiculous. Like I'll be in the gym, I'll want to try hard on some boulder, and I'll almost like think someone is watching me and expecting me to do it or not do it. And they're just, they have their headphones in climbing like across the gym. Like that person's watching me. Uh, so you said something about meditation, which when I think of meditation, I often think of the attempt to sit there, maintain focus, and perhaps watch thoughts come and go as they please and not put too much weight on them. And that's classically what I thought of as meditation. And then when I think about being on the connecting this to the idea of being on the big stage, trying to perform my best on a boulder, I'm wondering if when you're out there and you're competing on the biggest stage, if you can use quote unquote intrusive thoughts to your advantage, like I need to top this, like because this is a pivotal boulder, or my friends are there cheering on for me, like I can feel that energy, I can channel it, or if it's the attempt to kind of disassociate from everything and focus on the task at hand. Like that's something I always wonder about when I'm performing. Like, do I try to lean into the energy that kind of potential, that excitement, that intensity, or do I try to remove myself from it and just do the task at hand?
That is a great question, and one that I've thought about before because, yeah, classically meditation is seen as very individual and separating yourself from the environment. But I believe that there are different forms of meditation. And for me, when I'm in a competitive stage, I'm drawing energy from the crowd. I feel like the louder it is, the more intense the spotlight, the louder the music, I really feed off of that. So it's something that I allow into my meditative practice. It's one of those things where I feel like you can be selective about what comes in and what stays out. And for me, that is something that fuels me. And that's something that amps me up and something that makes me more focused. And that's not going to be true about everyone. But for me, the louder it is, the more focused I get, and I let it in, but I also at the same time continue to focus on the breathing. I When I'm practicing meditation at home, a lot of times it comes with feeling the inhale and the exhale, feeling the air leave and enter my body because in a competition environment, like you said, there's a lot of noise. Sometimes you can't hear your own breath, which is kind of a crazy thing to think about, but that's why I practice feeling my breath on my lips or feeling it in my body, feeling the different parts of my body move because sometimes that audible cue isn't necessarily there. So you have to be able to recenter yourself with maybe more tangible or physical cues, visual cues. There are a lot of ways to practice it, but yeah, I think that meditation can be active. I almost feel like I'm meditating the entire time I'm on a lead route. I get to a position, maybe it's you can relax your whole body or maybe you can just relax your one part of your body, but suddenly I will even shut my eyes. I'll shut my eyes, focus on the feeling of the breath leaving my lips, and it is able to kind of transport me into that meditative state, even for 2 seconds, just to kind of do a full reset before I kind of embark on the next part of the route.
So everyone talks about meditating. I feel like it definitely had its moment maybe a few years ago.
Yeah.
How do you actually bring it into your maybe daily, maybe weekly routine? Is it something that you do regularly? Is it something that you just do right, as you are building up to a competition? Like, what does it tactically look like for you in day to day life?
I try and keep up with it because I've realized that it affects how I interact with the world around me outside of climbing as much as it does inside of climbing. And I like the way I feel when I am more meditative and when I like how a lot of books will phrase this, separate the stimulus from the response and try and widen that gap. And I can be quick to react sometimes, and I definitely have experienced a lot of anxiety just because I'm a very anxious person, but it helps me to be more grounded and to react more thoughtfully in a way that's more true to myself and to my values when I meditate more frequently. But I definitely will increase the frequency or the duration before a competition when I'm really trying to get in the headspace. I'll even meditate in the gym before I even start every single workout just because I do that when I go to isolation for before a competition, and I like to try and recreate that environment every single time I'm in the gym, doing my whole warm up routine and then doing something that mimics the pressure of a competition environment. So I like doing every single part of my routine just to make it feel like second nature. And then what I've started doing more recently, which is, I don't know, maybe a little bit weird, maybe getting into the nitty gritty, but I will meditate in the sauna, which for me, I really like the sauna for a variety of reasons. I think that it has been helpful for recovery, and there's research that if you go into a sauna immediately post workout and you have a slight level of dehydration, you can increase your red blood cell count. Dr. Stacy Sims said that on the Huberman Lab podcast. But that is something I go into there anyway, but if I try and meditate while I'm in there, your body is really uncomfortable. Your body is very hot and it's hard to get a full breath without it feeling a little bit like it's burning. And if you, for me at least, in my experience, when I put myself into a meditative state in the sauna, it's almost like there are more factors that make it more difficult and you have to focus so heavily on your breathing that when I'm doing it on the wall, when I'm doing it outside of a sauna, when I'm just sitting on the ground. It feels almost easy. Like every breath is easy and light. So I like creating that contrast as well.
Well, you gotta get that cold plunge in after the sauna. I'm a big fan of the sauna cold plunge style. Okay, I'm gonna just go deeper on this because I find it really interesting.
Please.
We're talking about meditating and this kind of separation of stimulus and response. I totally get it. And that's something I practiced when I used to meditate, when it was more of a fad. I was involved in the fad is what
Okay.
it's supposed to be.
That's okay. Nothing wrong with being a bandwagoner.
Totally. I mean, it's just anyways. So then we're talking about performance and we're kind of talking about flow. And I think that when I think of flow, I almost think about the connection of stimulus and response being this really tightly coupled where it just kind of happens. I don't know if I'm sitting there and analytically saying, okay, I need to, bring my foot up here because that would give me better opposition. It just kind of flows out of me. It just happens. And so I'm curious how we connect these ideas of the power of meditation and being kind of separate from the world and being able to just kind of be there and not be distracted. And then what we're actually looking for, though, often in these flow states is it's almost like it's a lot of things and stuff, but we're somehow separate from it in this weird way and flow. And just like, do you see how those are like almost different, but I know that somehow they're deeply connected?
Yeah, it does seem a little bit paradoxical because everything that all the literature that you read, it is about trying to get that inherent like self two. They a lot of books will describe it as self one versus self two, like your analytical mind versus just your reactive mind. And you want to just let your body do what it wants to do. And I do see how that can be kind of contradictory, but I when I'm thinking about stimulus versus response, mostly for me, that means when I start to have an emotional reaction, when something, there's a stimulus and the response would be emotional, when I would potentially panic, when I would get upset or agitated because of a stimulus, that is where I want to create that gap. For me, sometimes that'll look like I'll be on a route and I'll do a move that maybe feels more challenging or more awkward or more uncomfortable than I initially imagined. And if I let my mind kind of spiral, if I'm immediate to react about it, I might think, oh no, the whole climb is going to be harder, or I didn't do that as efficiently as I wanted to do it. So I've wasted energy, and there are a million ways that your brain can start to flood with thoughts about analyzing that action, that movement, that event. And that is where I want to kind of create the biggest gap where I can have something happen that maybe isn't optimal in my perception of the route. And I'm able to take a moment to completely quiet my mind and think about the fact, well, I guess not think about anything ideally, but to kind of release all of the thoughts that start to flood my brain, and then just to focus on the texture of the hold, focus on the quality of my breath, focus on things that are very tangible in the present moment, and keep climbing. And yeah, I don't really know how to articulate the difference between letting self to do the movements, go through the motions versus and creating that gap. But for me, that's just how I think about it.
I think you resolved that paradox perfectly by talking about the emotional gap between stimulus and response. Because what I was thinking about is you're on the boulder, you're flowing, it's going great, and you think you have it. Not even you think you have it, you're just intuiting the next move. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, that crimp was bad. And maybe my beta is totally wrong. You fall and you're looking at it. And then you do need to switch into some level of analytical mind. You have to say, like,
Yeah.
okay, like if that doesn't work, what now? And so to me, I was like, oh, does that just break the flow and you're screwed? And but it's that separating that gap of not okay, because I couldn't do this move means I'm not going to do the boulder, means I'm not going to win, means everyone's going to hate me and my life is over right in this second and it's all bad. It's just, okay, let's resolve this moment right here. So I thought you did a great job of collapsing that. Yeah, that was
Thank
great.
you. Yeah, all just refocusing on the task at hand, all just returning to the present moment.
Okay, we talked a little bit about meditation, but you must have other mental drills because you talked about even trying to get yourself in situations that are just as intense and high pressure as a competition itself. So, what other ways do you practice mental performance when you're not actually out on stage?
I do a lot of reading, I do a lot of listening to podcasts, and I really like to absorb as much information as I possibly can about sports psychology because, I mean, first of all, it's something I'm just really passionate about. I find it super interesting and I love learning about it. But also, I like taking the nuggets of information that I glean from those podcasts, movies, books, whatever you have it, and applying them to my own performance. But that does have to happen in practice before it can happen in a competition. Otherwise, you're kind of just winging it. And what I've learned is that there are a lot of things that work for me, and there are a lot of things that don't necessarily work for me. So I'm responsible for parsing through that information before I get onto that big stage. So what I'll do is I'll read a book, for example, I'll think of a drill that would apply directly to climbing, or I'll go into the gym and do a drill, a mock round, or even something where I will try and repeat climbs I've already done, repeat boulders, and give myself one try on every single one. And if I don't do it, then I can't try it for the rest of the day. Or I'll go into the gym and I'll make a bet with someone. If I don't get this climb in 2 tries, I'm going to leave for the rest of the day. I'm not going to climb. Like, I try and create pressure, and it's one of those things where, like, you force yourself you have to be confident. If you're making a bet like that, you have to believe that you're going to do it. Otherwise, you're going home. Otherwise, your session is over. Like, there are ways that you can create pressure and force yourself to be confident. And that just is kind of like you reinforce it over and over again. You do this thing and you maybe are more successful than you expected, or you create the pressure and you rise to the occasion. And then the next time you're just that much more confident. So what I'll do is I'll do a drill like that. I'll come into it with a focus maybe from something I've read, something I've listened to, just some information that I've absorbed. I'll go into it and say, maybe this time I'm going to go into a mock round and try before I get on the wall. I'm going to take a deep breath in and shut my eyes and then exhale, open my eyes and get on the wall and try that every single time and see if it works for me. Or I'm going to focus on the texture of the hold before I get on to try and center myself in the present moment. Stuff like that. Or in the chair, I'm going to do this thing, this meditative practice, this breathing exercise, and maybe it works for me, maybe it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then I've tried it in practice and now I can let it go and now I can move on to the next thing. Or when I've found something that works really well, maybe I just don't mess with it. Maybe I just focus on my breathing and I do my routine and I don't try and add anything else because I don't want to overcomplicate it. It all for me is about trial and error. It's about absorbing information but then applying it, because if you read a bunch of books, that's cool. If you gain this knowledge, it's cool, but what if you don't apply it in a very tangible setting to your own performance? Then what does that knowledge really gain you? And I think that's true about studying anything. It's like you can read a million books on something, but if you don't apply it and you don't use it in some way that is advancing your understanding, then you can't really be the expert on it?
Yeah, I think we're all guilty of sometimes like reading a book and being like, "Yeah, I totally get it," and then someone asks you, like, "Can you explain it to me?" You're like, it's like this." And you go, "Oh crap, I don't actually know what I'm talking about." It's why they make you write papers in school instead of just reading the book, because you have to be able to list out your argument. I was going to ask you what you do in ISO before finals because it sounds like you have practiced these different drills to bring you into a specific desired mental state. And so maybe I can even expand that question. What's your current routine look like in ISO? What's your routine look like when you're sitting on the chair between boulders? And what does it look like when you find a rest mid lead route?
Yeah, I just journaled about all this, so it is very, very fresh. But in ISO, I mean, that is when you spend the majority of the time. 95% of a competition, what people don't realize, is spent in ISO, which is, it can be agony if you're not mentally prepared for it. It can be You're listening to everyone go out in front of you. You're hearing the crowd's reaction. If you go into it placed first, ranked first, you go out last. So you spend the longest time of anyone in isolation. And you are the only person in isolation when you go out for the last time. So there are a lot of ways that that can be very intimidating for a lot of people. For me, what I've learned is that I can't stay focused for 2-3 hours, even more sometimes. I can't maintain a level of high focus for the entire duration, or I just get exhausted and kind of wired up by the time that I go out and compete. So for me, a lot of ISO looks like trying to relax and have fun. And some people, it's just headphones on, serious the entire time, and that works for them. But for me, it's going around, hanging out with my friends, having conversations, playing card games, doing things that are fun and make me laugh and kind of lower my cortisol. And then when it comes time to warm up, that's when the headphones go on. That's when I start slowly building up my adrenaline and the intensity. And it starts pretty casual with calming music, just trying to warm up the body. Maybe I have the noise cancellation feature on my headphones on because I don't necessarily like listening to the crowd while I'm in the ISO. I don't need to know specifics about anyone's performance, and I prefer not to, but I move around. I slowly amp up the music. I have a bunch of different songs saved on my iPod where I can kind of self select. And a lot of it is auto regulation. You kind of figure out what you need in the moment. If I'm really feeling wired up more than usual, I'll listen to something that is way more soothing and I'll try and focus on my breath work more. And sometimes I come into a comp and I'm like, man, I cannot really get that psyched for it. Like, I'm excited to be here and I'm grateful, obviously, but maybe I'm just not amped up enough. Maybe I just don't want it enough. Maybe I'm not like feeling that killer instinct. So I'll listen to like way more intense music and I'll do visualizations that are kind of reflective of the type of performance I want to have, whether that's me grabbing finish holds and like fist pumping in front of a crowd, or whether that's like a leopard hunting its prey. Like there are things that aren't even climbing related, like a river flowing, that just are mental imagery that kind of set the tone for what type of performance I want to have and what level of arousal you want to be in at the time. And that is different for me for lead and for bouldering. In bouldering ISO, a lot of times it's like pump up, super like I want to be at a very heightened level of arousal because I want to be ready to go full power, commit to coordination moves right off the bat. And for lead, you want to start the route as calm and collected as possible. And it kind of is a different mentality for me, which is also what makes it so interesting that a lot of events have bouldering and lead, because you have to do this major tone shift between the disciplines. And a lot of people struggle with that. And also sometimes there are tone shifts mid route or mid boulder round where it's you've done a power boulder, your heart is racing, and then suddenly you're on a very slow technical slab. Or you're kind of cruising through the beginning of a rope route, and then 4 clips up, you don't expect it, but there's a burly section where you're super engaged, and then you have to relax and continue. So doing those tone shifts in practice or in isolation, I think kind of prepare you for that. And then when you're talking about the chair, you have less time if you're, especially if you're right before a lead round, you don't know how long you're in the chair because it is all dependent on how long the person ahead of you takes. So you're sitting in the chair, you have to be ready to go whenever, ready to drop the headphones whenever. For me, it's all about music, but you have to be ready to go. So you're on and you're prepared, but you're also relaxed. So it's like trying to strike that balance. And then in the bouldering chair, you've got 4 or 5 chairs between boulders where all you do or all I do is try to get in the exact right arousal state for the next boulder. And whether that's I am panting and I'm super amped up and I need to bring myself back down, or I need to hype myself up because maybe my energy level wasn't quite high enough on the previous boulder. There's so much that is just about knowing yourself. And I think that is why meditation in practice is so critical, is because you need to be able to, you have to have the body awareness to know where you're at, know how you feel and whether you need to amp up or amp down and how to regulate that.
Please share with us your favorite hype up song and your favorite chill out song that you use. You gotta tell us.
I I love the Creed movies. I love Michael B. Jordan for many reasons. I'll leave it at that. I love Michael B. Jordan, but the Creed movies are like the perfect amp up movie. There's one song from Creed 2, which is the best Creed movie, and it's called Runnin'. It just that is the song that gets me like so maximally amped up in the 2.5 minute span. And then for me, what kind of amping down a lot of times has to do with just loosening up and having fun. And for me, that is Taylor Swift every single time. So something that's going to get me kind of singing and dancing along totally relaxes me, totally gets me having fun. And that for me is what down regulating looks like. But for other people, it could be maybe like, I don't know, meditation chants or like spa music. That is just conjecture. I have no idea. But for me, it's something that gets me loose and having fun as opposed to something that just gets me like quiet.
Those are great. Yeah, Taylor Swift. Good to know. I'll totally build that into my habits. Uh,
Great.
yeah, I think it's interesting this idea of really having to know yourself because I'm the kind of person who gets nervous before I go out on stage, and then I'm really calm when I get out there. And something that I've read and I've noticed in myself too is that typically what we find is that people get over amped for competition and under amped for training. And I liked some of those styles of bringing in intensity by making bets, wherever like coming up with stories, as well as knowing when you need to lower yourself for comps and, hype yourself up. And even though I know that about myself, I found that I often still am too hyped for competitions. I come out and I think I've calmed down, but I'm over gripping. I'm just doing too much. And, you know, I don't know. I guess my question there is just, did you find that it took a while for you to understand what your psych level actually was? Like, was there ever a disconnect there where you'd come out and be like, oh, actually, I am freaking out right now?
Yes, sometimes that still happens to me because it's hard to get it right every single time, especially if you've taken a break from competition, especially if you are at a level of a competition that is maybe different from the ones that you've done previously. But the cool thing about competition climbing is that if you go out and immediately you realize that you are too amped up, you have the opportunity on a lead route or on a boulder to calm yourself down. You have the opportunity to take a step back. You get on the climb, you say you get on a boulder, you fall, you're like, whoa, that was maybe way too much. You can take as much time as you need to get back on the wall. Yeah, you have a time limit, but the fact that you have a time limit should not incentivize you to get on the wall if you're not ready, because that just is a wasted attempt. So for me, I get on the wall, I have that experience. If I need to take a full minute to just calm myself down on the pad, I will take that time because I know that getting on the wall in the right headspace is more important than getting on the wall at a certain time every single time. And on a lead route, you get through the first few clips, you're like, whoa, that was like, I'm overdoing it a little bit. You just have to relax. You have to find a spot where you're able to fully stop, fully reflect or reset, and know, at least not think about it, but recognize that doing a few clips over gripping is not going to make or break your climb. You have to believe that. You have to know that you over grip, sure, but you're changing it and you're moving forward. And all that matters is that you're moving forward with a new mindset, with a new flow. You're able to change it in the moment. It may be harder in lead than it is in bouldering, but it totally is possible.
When I was watching the Olympics, I was watching Yanya on the lead route, and she had kind of had a rough fourth boulder where she had maybe tweaked her finger or got that kind of stuck. Things didn't go, maybe not even her fault, just things did not happen like maybe she expected. And I watched her get about a third of the way up. It was as there was a kind of like a traverse to the right. It was a little more powerful, a little more heel hooky, and I just saw her kind of fumble, look a little tight. Like I don't know, she just didn't. She was struggling for just a moment. I was like, oh, interesting. Like, what's going to happen here? Because she could have fallen apart there, but then you watch her compose herself, and you're like, okay, like she's back on track. But I just thought it was a good example when that came to mind when I saw someone lose themselves for a moment, recenter, and show up and be the climber she was trying to be. So
Yeah, a lot of times it is visible, it is noticeable, but And that also goes to show that the best in the world can struggle with the mental stuff too, especially in such a high pressure environment, especially when those expectations have been put on her for as long as she's been competing. I mean, being on top for that long, that consistently is hard on anyone. And she's human. And I don't know. I think that that is a great reminder that you can have those moments of doubt, that you can be struggling, that you can be tight, but you can also, she has more experience than anyone too. And you could see that she turned it around and she decided to give that climb everything she had, even if maybe she was tight before, even if the round wasn't going her way, because she has that experience and she's done it a million times and she fell back on that, which I think is really, really inspiring.
Yeah, this all goes back to that concept of physically everyone, or physically and thus theoretically, everyone on that stage can do these boulders or these routes, but it's can you do that right now? And you said that if you felt like you weren't in the right headspace, whether it was on a boulder or a lead, you can take a moment and recognize that, hey, I need to get in the right headspace so I can perform in this moment. You said, oh, I've got a full minute, Josh. Like I have a full minute to calm down. But just being honest about the scenarios I've been in, where sometimes in those moments I just think, oh dude, okay, like you need to calm down right now. Okay, like you have only 1 minute. Like it's almost like instead of going into the calming down phase, I'm like stuck in the phase before actually doing the thing. Does that make sense? Like, and
Yeah.
just like, can you speak to like how you, like, I know what you're saying to do, but how do you do the actual thing as best as possible when it happens?
For me, I think it helps to have an anchor where if you sense that you're kind of spiraling out, if you sense that you're putting pressure on yourself to feel better more quickly, there are things, mental triggers maybe, that kind of bring you back to the present. For me, recently it's all been about having fun, where I'll start to be in this mindset and I'll ask myself, what are we doing here? Like, really, what are we doing here? I'm trying to do a boulder because I want to do the boulder. That is kind of what it boils down to. I'm climbing. That's all I'm doing. I'm climbing and I'm trying to get to the top. And once I ask myself that, it's an immediate mental trigger to flip that switch, revert back to kind of what my values are and take a step back, take a step away from everything that might be clouding my brain or clouding my judgment. And that looks different for different people, but yeah, for me it's just I need to trigger myself to remember what's actually important sometimes.
Yeah, I like this idea of anchoring and of just of practicing. Like when it comes down to it, it's like you said that you imbibe these books and then you bring things into your training to test out, and then you find the ones that you like, and then you again kind of test it out in the next competition, and then the next one, and then the next one. And I just think that's something that's, it's just, whenever you're looking for some panacea or silver bullet, it's like it's out there if you sort through 100 and try them all, and then you finally found your silver bullet. But there's not just one, and I want to emphasize that what I'm hearing from you is, well, you got to find out for yourself, and the way you find out is by finding out, not just
Yeah,
hoping.
that and also that not all of them are going to feel immediately perfect and remembering that as well. Maybe there is some perfect cure all for you, but maybe there isn't. And for me, meditation felt really hard at first. It felt uncomfortable, it felt hard, it felt unnatural, and it took months of practice before it started feeling like my breath was coming more easily and I was able to start kind of reflecting, coming back to the moment, avoiding distractions. It just wasn't natural at first. And a lot of things aren't going to be natural at first, but like anything else, it just takes hard work. And some things you know right away, you're like, not for me. But some things you got to give a little bit of time, which is the one thing I would add on to that.
When I think about meditating and my experience with it, when I realized that those, I'm going to say intrusive thoughts, but really they were any thoughts. Oh, like my finger tickles. Oh, I need to take out the trash tomorrow. Like, don't forget that, Josh. It was just this, instead of them being bad, it was this recognition that those will come and go, and you just are trying to focus on your breath, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
And that ability to recognize things will come and go and to have that focus on whatever it is that you choose, it's something that is a really big superpower, especially in today's world of everything, tons of distractions. But I think that one of the reasons why it's important, but then we often do things to shortcut it, is that when I do dangerous stuff in climbing, it's like my focus, laser focused. I'm like, if I fall, I'm going to get seriously injured. And I think competition does that same thing, where you just hype it up. You feel like the stakes are really high. And for some that can break their focus, but often it actually enhances my focus. And I just think there's something to having more control over those moments, instead of trying to just say like, I'm going to make it really risky so that my intensity is amped up and I'm focused because I'm, fight or flight kind of deeply, in this moment. I just think building that control is something that I think you might be onto something there.
Yeah, I do think that there are ways that I naturally maybe am fortunate to get more focused in high pressure situations. And I think that, I mean, even as a kid, before I was aware that sports psychology existed, I often would get more focused when the stakes were high. But then I realized that that was contingent on certain things. For example, like we talked about before, being an underdog. Every time I was an underdog, laser focused, the crowd was nothing but helpful. I became kind of a different person under the spotlights. But when I was expected to win, I often struggled to do so. And I think that's true for a lot of people, where, yeah, it immediately, when you're under the spotlight, yes, there is a sense of your body naturally wants to go into that focused place. But I think that for me, it was about how do we come to this place in all circumstances? How do we make sure that we are consistently finding a flow state no matter what the external factors are?
Yeah, I wish I could do it super consistently.
Yeah, I mean, same.
It's a great feeling too, when you're just right there. You talked about journaling a few times. Tell me more about your journaling practice, and is it something that you do for just climbing, or is it just kind of all of life?
It started with something that I did for all of life. Now my life is primarily climbing, so it ends up being mostly about climbing. But oftentimes there are things that you kind of maybe push to the side that aren't climbing related, that are interfering with your overall psyche, maybe. And I've experienced that, especially more recently. I did a drill that I learned about on the Huberman Lab podcast, which I'll probably reference a lot because I listen to it pretty regularly. But there was a drill about journaling where you sit down for a period of time. It could be 10 minutes, 15 minutes, and you write about something very traumatic to you. And while that seems counterintuitive, like that would just drudge up some very negative thoughts, it can actually be really therapeutic because you're addressing those thoughts head on and you're able to parse through, what do I actually think about these things? What do I feel about them? How does it define me? How do I separate myself from these things and how do I move forward? So that's one form of journaling that is very intense, but for me can be effective. And I mean, trauma I use kind of loosely because there have been performances in my past that I haven't been able to even watch the video of because I just honestly feel shame. And I realized that recently, where I refused to watch the video footage of my final route at US team trials this year, in the exact same way that I refused to watch the video of my Nationals 2021 performance when I fell on the finish move of the route and didn't win the competition. And then it just felt so traumatic to me. And obviously, we're talking about in a hierarchy, right? Like, it's climbing trauma, it's not that deep. But for me, I just wouldn't watch this video and I wouldn't even think about it. And every time I thought about it, it just made me feel kind of sick. And so I made myself rewatch the video. It was not as bad as I thought it was. Journaled about it, journaled about everything that I learned from it, journaled about everything that made me uncomfortable about that, and also just the whole situation, everything about that time period of my life. And I came out of it thinking, wow, that was just a climbing competition. And I didn't have that perspective beforehand. I knew it was a climbing competition, but it felt like so much heavier. And I think that sometimes doing that kind of relieves a burden that you don't even know you're carrying. So that's one way that I journal, but also it's kind of the day to day. I like journaling about the wins, the little wins, and also just the learning moments because I don't like, otherwise, I feel like sometimes I forget about them or they kind of go to the wayside. But I like journaling about how I feel. I like journaling about my mental state, about my physical state. And often it isn't about, I sent this grade at the gym today. It was really cool. It's like, I felt this way. I felt this way mentally when I got on the climb. I was so composed. I felt like I was super present, and from my fingertips to like every extremity, I just was there on the wall. And I feel like it was because I did this beforehand, but let's try something new tomorrow. It's like a lot of it is very, we're trying to analyze the moment, not overanalyze it, but get a sense of this is working and I'm excited by this and I'm going to keep trying this next time.
Yeah, it's a lot better than just leaving up to chance always. And I journal every day more on life stuff. I use the day one app. I'm like 2,500 day streak, which I'm pretty proud of because
Whoa, that is amazing. That is remarkable.
it's a lot if you add it up.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just got on that idea of journaling traumatic experiences. The one thing I know, I don't know if maybe I listened to that same podcast. It's this idea that it can be really powerful because you have open loops, like something that when you reflect on upsets you, it's often because you like don't know why. But uh, they say be careful in the first 6 months after you've had that traumatic experience, that revivifying a trauma can sometimes not be so great. But
Oh,
if it's,
interesting. Good to know.
yeah, because I think then you're like, it's kind of like you're reliving it, perhaps like your mental plasticity, you haven't solidified things. But then if you have this rumination, this kind of like, gosh, like this went like this, and it's this open loop that you aren't really learning from, that then that's maybe a good time that anything that sticks out in your head as being really upsetting that's been 5 years might be worth really diving deep into, because maybe you didn't learn the lesson, and maybe your body and brain are telling you something like, hey, like something's still here, like you didn't, you know uh, you didn't learn all you could from this, and so that's why we can't give it a rest.
Yeah, totally. And it's also can be hard to be vulnerable like that with yourself or especially on paper, but I think that that is also one of those things that comes with practice and with time because the more you're able to express yourself and the more maybe it feels kind of good to do that or you're able to understand yourself more deeply, the more you're incentivized to keep doing it. And that's how I felt where I would never have written down some of the things that I wrote down more recently, I think, but except for the fact that I've been doing it for a while and it really, yeah, for me, it felt good to just, it feels good to work through things and to understand yourself and to see where am I with this? Why do I feel a certain way? And how do I move on? Does it affect my identity? And a lot of times for me, it's the answer ends up being no, it doesn't affect my identity. And like by holding on to it, I am carrying something with me that I don't need to be.
Well, and just to make sure it's not a heavy lift for people if they try this out, I my journal will be like, I did a podcast with Melina and went climbing today. Cool. Like, and then like a picture of, the park that I went on a walk in. Like, and then someday I'll randomly write unbelievable amounts for no reason, and just giving yourself the ability to kind of have that practice of showing up, giving a space if you want it, and then like not taking it, and then, oh my gosh, I don't know why, but I just had to write for 15 minutes. Like it just kind of popped out. And I don't know, just I think that that's nice, not be like, what you need to do is open up your journal every day and spill your
No,
guts.
I
And if you don't,
agree.
then you're blowing it. So I, I kind of on this note, but it's just something before we leave comp climbing, because it's just, you're a wealth of information on it, and clearly you are in love with it, and
I
putting a lot of effort
am.
in. There's this quote that I'm not sure which book it came from. Maybe you can remember it, but it was this idea of look good, feel good, play good. And we were talking about kind of acting like yourself. What does that quote mean to you, and what does it mean to act like yourself?
Yeah, it means Oh my gosh. I feel like there's so much to unpack here for a quote that is so short and not grammatically correct. There's so much to unpack here because yeah, we had this conversation and it really inspired me to think more about it. But I show up to every competition and even to the gym a lot of the time nowadays. I show up looking the way that I want to, I guess, present myself to the world and I want to look good, but I want to look a certain way that makes me feel good and makes me feel confident. And for me, sometimes that looks like doing my hair and doing my makeup and putting on an outfit that I think is cute. But whatever it means to you, whatever you can show up to an event in, and this applies well outside of climbing too. This can be giving a presentation at your work or doing something, I don't know, with your extended family that you feel a little bit nervous about. Like this is just such an important lesson that I've learned for my entire life is if you show up and you put things in place to make yourself feel confident. Look good can be interpreted many different ways. For me, a lot of times that is physically looking good, but for some people that means standing with better posture. For some people that has a lot to do with just the aura that they try to emit. And for me, showing up at a competition and projecting this image of myself, yeah, it could be perceived as I want people to look at me, I want the attention from other people, and I want to be perceived a certain way. But in actuality, I think I want to show up feeling a certain way and looking a certain way that triggers my brain to act a certain way. And for me, I know that when I show up to a competition looking at my best and then therefore feeling my most confident, that's when I perform my best. There, it is a mental trigger that it's game time and it's time for me to leave it all out there on the wall because I'm feeling my best about myself, whether that be how I look or also just how I'm gonna climb.
Yeah, look good, feel good, play good. I just I think it's funny because we're doing a podcast, and so people are listening, but you definitely, presented yourself well. You look good, Melina.
Oh, thank you.
I showered as well. I'm right here for all those listeners. Uh, so how does that connect to acting like yourself? What does that mean in the context of putting on your best self, feeling like your best self? Like it's so strange to me that that is almost like this act that you put on to be the best version of yourself. How's that domino effect work to be your best self on stage?
Yeah, it is. It is like you're putting on maybe a second character. And I know we talked about this before, but Alex Johnson talked about this in her podcast as well. She was talking about Beyonce being Sasha Fierce on stage and how there's this alternate persona that shows up to an event, and that's what you want to project. Um, and I thought that was just a really cool way of thinking about it. And yeah, it is like you are creating this second persona. I feel like when I show up to a competition, I act differently than I do in the gym, maybe. I act differently than I do with my friends, with my family. For me, it's all game time. And that isn't necessarily to try and be a facade or to try and show other people that I'm so confident, that I'm so ready. It's to show myself realistically. I show up and I have this alter ego almost. And when I become her, I know that I'm going to top every boulder. There's a mental cascade that happens when I show up a certain way, when I show up with a certain attire, looking a certain way, when I show up with a certain posture, with I try and bring with me the feeling that I get every single time I do those things. Every single time I show up to a competition, it's exactly the same. And every single time, it's a mental trigger that, yeah, it's game time. This is what I do when I compete, and this is how I want to feel. So I'm going to show up and I'm going to put all the cards in place for me to feel that way. And this alternate persona of myself that shows up to comps is always ready. And I have 100% confidence in that version of myself.
So what happens when you're traveling and you accidentally forget your favorite pair of shorts or something and you have to borrow someone's? Like what happens when things go wrong?
That is an interesting question because yeah, you always want to present the best that you can and also like you don't necessarily want things to throw you off, but I think a lot of mental training, as we're continuing to talk about that, is about adaptability. How I think that it's fun. I think it's almost a fun exercise to say, what could go wrong today? And like, wouldn't it be kind of cool if something did go wrong and I had to overcome that adversity? And I think that is a mindset that I haven't always had. But for me at this point in my career, every single thing that goes awry is an opportunity for me to overcome it. And that is part of the enjoyment of competition for me. Because it's rare that you show up and everything goes perfectly, even if those little slip ups or mistakes or inefficiencies even are only on the wall. There still isn't going to be a perfectly seamless competition, maybe once in a blue moon. But you can't be expecting that every single time, and you can't overreact to anything that happens. So, yeah, what if I don't have my favorite pair of shorts? What if I showed up at a competition in Costa Rica and I forgot a shirt? Like any shirt? I was wearing this like oversized cut off hoodie, and then I didn't put a shirt on underneath it. And then I showed up and I was like, I can't climb without a shirt. So I had to borrow my brother's sweaty shirt because he was competing too, and the gym was 100 degrees. I had to borrow his sweaty, disgusting shirt and put my bib on it, and it was super baggy and it was really, really gross. But that just is one of those things where it's like if you look at every source of adversity as an opportunity, as something kind of fun and kind of funny, I I mean, there's no reason why it should affect your performance if you don't let it.
Yeah, that just goes back to what you were saying earlier about when you flip that framing on comps where you were dreading them and then you enjoyed them because they were a challenge and that's what you were out there look like. What are we doing? If I just told you, hey, every time you pull on, you're going to win. Every time you pull on, you're going to do a boulder, and there's nothing you have to do other than just pull on. It's like, what are we even doing? Like that challenge and that excitement to confront the unknown, I think is a hallmark of a competitor, really.
Yeah, that is so well said. That is what I tell comp kids all the time because, yeah, and it seems like so ideal to be able to guarantee success, but then how fun is that? Would you still compete? I know that I wouldn't. I know that I wouldn't keep going if I knew I was guaranteed success every single time because it takes all of the unknown and all of the adversity out of the equation, which is ultimately why we all do it. It should be a test of how well have I prepared.
The funny thing is, though, is that what it means to show up and be Sasha Fierce or wherever your alter ego is to have this ridiculously optimistic mindset that actually mirrors that. We're like, no, I'm going to top all the bowlers. I'm going to win. Like that. That's just what I'm going to do. And it's funny how it's like you have to have that mindset, but then recognize that there is no guarantees. I often tell people that the mindset to adopt to continue improving is to be ridiculously optimistic about yourself. Like I will be the first one to climb V20. I am the greatest. I'm great. And then be extremely brutal about where you're failing, why you didn't send, and be really honest. So it's like you have to be completely irrational and completely honest at the same time with yourself. And I love this is why I love this conversation is because it's full of paradoxes and juxtapositions.
Yeah, it can get very philosophical very quickly, but it's fun.
I mean, we could have made it really physics based too, because you're kind of actually doing something very physical.
Yeah, true.
Okay, well, on that note, let's go outdoors. Melina, I actually even heard a rumor one time. I don't know if it's true that you were approached by a major outdoor climbing brand and that you turned them down because you just didn't feel like it represented you because you were an indoor climber. Did I just make that up, or is that something that actually happened? You please do not name names.
I have been, yes. I'm very particular about my style and about my interests, and at the end of the day, I care a lot about holding true to my values. And that doesn't necessarily mean that I my value is not climbing outdoors, but if something doesn't necessarily represent who I am, and I don't think I can authentically kind of be an ambassador for a brand or an organization or whatever, then I don't think it serves me or serves them, and I think sometimes that is the best course of action for me, just to be truly honest. Because I want to believe in what I'm representing. I want to believe in the brands that I support, and at this point, I really do. Every brand that I work with, I love their products, and I feel like I'm able to be my most authentic self in them. So yes, but that isn't to say that I don't like outdoor climbing, because as we may be hinting at, maybe I'm turning over a new leaf.
Well said about representing brands that you actually want to represent, because that's something, when you're in the limelight, you really want to be authentic for probably a reason that maybe people don't anticipate. Where if you are out there and people are watching you and seeing you, they put in their head some vision and version of you. And if it's somehow separate from who you actually are, it's it sucks. Like I get approached because of the podcast, and I try to be who I am. Well, maybe like my Sasha Fierce version of me on the podcast, but I want to make sure that I'm that person in real life too, because otherwise it just makes life difficult. Like what mask am I putting on in this moment? And that's not fun. So I applaud you. I get it. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to say that that whole looking good and feeling good. So this is totally different than climbing, but I used to work in finance, and we wore suits, and I was like a young guy, fresh out of college, and I freaking loved it. And I love wearing suits. I love dressing up in that stuff, because you feel great. And I'll tell you what, everyone in the world treats you differently too. They're nicer to you when you buy coffee, and then all of a sudden you are the kind of person who holds the door open for everyone. And I don't know, there's something about putting on clothes, putting on your uniform, and it really does change the way the world appears to you, and thus the way you interact with it, which I love. So I just wanted to echo that and tell people to wear more suits. That's basically what I'm
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, basically. I agree with that 100%.
Okay, so what's the difference between outdoor climbing and indoor climbing for you?
For me, there are a lot of differences. Most of my energy, as I've said before, has always been placed in indoor climbing and in competition climbing. And for the longest time, I really didn't see the appeal of climbing outside. I felt very fulfilled by what I was doing indoors, and I thought, if I'm, what is different about projecting and sending something inside versus outside, aside from the fact that outside there are bugs and there's dirt and there's hiking. So in my mind, it was a very simple answer. And what I've learned more recently is that it's more multifaceted than that. And I had to first find climbs outdoors that spoke to me more. I think that's a challenge for a lot of people when they're young and inexperienced. You go with your friends, you go with your mentors, you go with your team. You don't necessarily have the free agency to pick your climbs or pick your location. And maybe for me, that was one of the things that didn't immediately grab me about climbing, is that the styles that I was put on maybe weren't my favorite. Maybe the areas that I went to weren't places that I would be itching to return to. But with experience, especially more recently in the past year and a half, I have been fortunate enough. I'm dating one of the people with the most experience outdoor climbing of probably anyone. Alex and I was very resistant at first, and I think she was kind of bummed because she was like, "Cool, I'm dating a climber. Let's go outdoors every day." And I was like, "Hell no, I'm not interested at all." But slowly but surely, she's really receptive to the styles that I like. I'll tell her what I'm interested in, and she'll pull up videos of boulders, and she'll be like, "Does this look cool? What about this? What about this style of hold, this style of rock, this style of movement?" And then brought me to a couple places more recently where the style was really fun, and I went into it with no expectations, and I didn't have to hike as far as I maybe otherwise would have. The first climb that I ever projected, first boulder I ever projected outside, was so close to the road that you could throw a crash pad from the car to the boulder. And that just sit super right with my soul. And I projected it for, not super long when you're looking at the scheme of things. When she projected the swarm for 10 years, I projected this boulder for 3 days. But it was really fun slowly unlocking sequences and showing myself that moves that felt completely impossible day one or hour one, I was linking from the bottom day three. And I was thinking, if I can make those sorts of leaps in a span of 3 days, what's preventing me from getting on something a little harder, a little more technical, a little more difficult to read, and just slowly working out the sequences? That just isn't something that I'd ever done before. And it's something that is, you kind of, you can do it indoors, but it's harder when the setting turnover rate is high, when there aren't features in the walls. So it really is just what is screwed on in the color that you're climbing. And it just opened my eyes.
Yeah, how did you go about figuring out these subtleties and these movements that you couldn't do previously? It's if you didn't have that skill set already from only having 4 minutes on a hard boulder, like what how did you go about tackling that? How did you decide, oh, if this foot doesn't work, I'll go to this foot? Like what was that process like for you when you finally implemented it?
It is hard to change your whole mentality around climbing. Like, what is a hold? What's on? I remember one of the first times I went outdoor climbing, I asked my friend, I was like, is this on? And he was like, everything's on. It's a rock. And that, it just is it's a paradigm shift, quite frankly. And I had to become a lot more creative, and I had to change the way I saw the boulder itself. I had to change the way I saw the rock, and it opened my eyes to a lot of new possibilities. And I do think that I mean, it probably could be conducive to a lot more creative styles of climbing indoors when you are willing to be scrappy. You're willing to try anything and use absolutely anything, any feature with any body part. It just, I don't know. I think it was hard to adjust to that, but I'm sure it would unlock tons of doors in indoor competition climbing as well. But yeah, it was hard to initially make that mental shift. But as I started to be more creative and I realized that there were so many possibilities, um, it just is different and very eye opening, and something that I genuinely, for the first time, genuinely do want to invest more time and more energy in. And I've got actually quite a few trips outdoors planned, which I think is great for my competition climbing too, because I have all of these things that I'm looking forward to that don't all hinge on one event. And for me, that is how I perform my best, when I'm really inspired by a lot of things and not all the pressure is on one performance. And there's a whole outdoor season that I just have absolutely never paid any attention to before that is starting now.
Well, I just want to let you know that you may be one of those people who, when they do better outdoors, they do even better indoors, where a lot of people are the opposite way. But for whatever reason, I mean, maybe it's because I grew up in the gym and I was probably one of the first gym rats. And I, I do like nature, but I mean, I hear what you're saying. Your argument is not falling on deaf ears about like, why would you hike and worry about conditions when we just have great climbs here and it's just right here
Yeah.
always. It's well lit, no worries. We don't even have to drive very far. And I find that the better I get outdoors, the better I get indoors, which is interesting. And I think it has something to do with that subtlety, that creativity. But I was kind of surprised to hear that that change in vision required for you, because when I see you on these really intricate comp climbs, I'll see you look at the seams between a volume and in the wall, like everything is on in competition climbing in some ways. And I actually I caught a lot of flack for this because of my wording, but actually I encourage people to quote unquote cheat indoors, in the sense of look for those seams, look for, could you grab that foot instead of just using it as a foothold, because could you use it as a handhold, because I think that's the right mentality, is to open your vision up to whatever's possible. And I always love in modern day comp climbing where the watching a comp climber, a good comp climber, rapid fire through like something like four different positions on the volume. It's like, oh, is it, can I undercling it? No, no. What about Gaston? Can I toe hook it? Okay, like I'm just going to go for this. And so I was a little surprised to hear that, just because when I watch you climb on competition routes, it seems like you have that creativity in spades.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that I do. I definitely value scrappiness, especially in comps, because it doesn't matter how pretty something looks. A lot of people get kind of caught up in that mindset, like, I have to do it the intended way, I have to make it look how the setters want me to make it look. And in comp climbing, that just isn't true. In gym climbing, yes, my first attempt is always scrappy, get to the top no matter what, do whatever it takes. I will go back though and do climbs the quote unquote right way, the intended way, just to kind of learn to broaden my arsenal. And like, I want to have as many tools available in my toolkit as possible. So I will go back and I'll do climbs the intended way, or a different beta break, or I'll eliminate holds. There are tons of ways that you can use the climbs that exist and get more out of them than was ever intended. That's what I think. But yeah, I think that I have developed a level of scrappiness climbing inside and climbing on comp routes. I'll do things that are completely wrong and completely weird and uncomfortable. In nationals last year on my final boulder, I'd already won the comp, but I just felt, like I was saying before, I needed to top the route. I needed very desperately to top the route, and I did the most disgusting drop knee. Everyone at home was like, I don't understand how your ligaments are still intact. I skipped a dyno, a coordination dyno, by doing the world's deepest drop knee. And yeah, sometimes you just are possessed to think outside the box, but you do have to do that in practice as well. You have to get in the mindset of do or die, especially your first attempt. Get on and get to the top of the wall no matter what it takes, and then go back and do it clean.
Melina, be careful on those drop knees. Just be careful.
I will, especially with Alex's torn ACL.
Yeah. Okay, let's not laugh about that. That was
not funny. Not funny at all.
No, too soon still. She should probably journal about it.
Yeah, probably.
Okay, you said something along the lines of you weren't necessarily attracted to specific lines outdoors, and maybe it wasn't in your style. You didn't get to choose. Now you find one that sounded like you were attracted to it because of the lack of approach. But what I'm curious about is someone who's really spent a lot of time indoors and focused on competition climbing. What does attract you to boulders, and what does attract you to indoor boulders, and what is now starting to attract you in outdoor boulders other than lack of approach?
For me, it used to be, what is the hardest grade I think I can do inside? And usually that would be something heinously crimpy up a steep face, and I was just content with that. Whereas now, a lot more, I'm focusing on complexity of movement, and a lot of it has to do with body position or coordination, or something that I feel like tests me in a way that isn't entirely crimp strength. I'm great at crimping. I just find it a little bit boring personally. I know that that is a lot of people's styles, and I also know that, I mean, possibly the way that I could climb the hardest stuff outside, the hardest grades on paper, would be to just pick crimpy lines. But that isn't necessarily what inspires me. I really like doing things with weird body positions. I like doing things that are super dynamic. That's something that I haven't always been, is powerful and dynamic. But I've worked really, really hard on it, especially as I've talked about adapting to new styles of competition. It's so much more about power now than it is even about strength, in my experience. And I have done a lot of work on power to the point where I feel like I graphed it even over time. I was using the Tindeck, which can measure not only force but power output, and I was graphing both my strength and power over time, and I tripled my just two arm power output over the span of, I think, 2 months, which is kind of insane. I mean, some of that probably has to do with technique. There are other factors, so I would err on the side of like maybe doubling. But seriously, I changed the way that I climb by focusing on power, and by training more intelligently by doing strength cycles into power cycles, making that look more linear. But I digress. I like climbs that challenge me in ways, in a variety of different ways, and I want that to be mental, I want that to be body position, I want that to be dynamic, and then if there are cramps, then sick. I like it to have a little bit of everything, just a fun little mix. That's my style.
Have you heard about the swarm? It's got crimps and power. It was,
So I've heard. So I have heard.
we'll talk in 10 years.
Yeah, I will not be trying something for 10 years. Well, shoot, maybe I don't think she was intending on trying it for 10 years at first, but really caught her
Oh,
attention. Maybe I'll have a 10-year project.
God, it's interesting that you were able to really increase your power, and regardless of whatever the numbers are. Something that I was just chatting with my buddy Cy about this. Cy Moore, great guy on Ireland and a coach. It's all about coordination. Like coordination, it's this slippery word, and I don't want to go too deep into it. But when you say you increased your power, like, did you get way big, stronger back muscles? It's like, oh, maybe like a little bit or something. Like maybe something happened there, but that's not really what we're talking about when we're talking about power. It was coordinating your movement, understanding how to apply your force in a new way. And I actually, one thing that we didn't get into, I don't want to rewind completely, but I said something about kids and what makes them excel at comps. And last time we chatted, you brought up a few things about why you think kids have done better at comps. And it's not just that the style has changed. What are some, can you relate to your pursuit of new styles to increase and improve that you see young kids just being willing to also throw themselves at things, quote unquote, new styles for them?
That was really well worded to link what we were talking about now to present. Nice job.
I
Yeah,
try.
yeah, what I do think that is, it's really cool watching children climb, especially right when they're starting to learn, because it seems like they are just absolute sponges for information, and they're willing to try things 100 different ways, even the ways that, I mean, someone like us, we could watch and be like, that is not going to work. There is no way that works. That just, it doesn't, failure does not affect a lot of the kids, and the concept of failure just does not exist. They're willing to spam attempts, they're willing to try absolutely everything, and I think that that really lends itself to developing kind of this innate understanding of momentum, especially because a lot of kids don't have the upper body strength yet to engage in those powerful movements that maybe you do as an adult. And that requires them to really think outside the box and to generate momentum in different ways. I know I've heard that there is a coach who works with youth athletes, like within USA Climbing, who deliberately doesn't have their kids do any strength training, or even, I think the joke was, I don't want my kids to even be able to do a pull up until they're able to do these coordination moves, because you do have to think outside the box and you have to execute them in exactly the way that is designed for your body to go through these motions. Because if you don't have the power to cheat it or to try and muscle your way through it, you have to just go with that flow, and it teaches your body a very natural way of movement. And then if you develop strength on top of that, then you have the whole arsenal. And I think it maybe inhibits people who already have that strength from developing that type of movement, because you want to cheat it. You want to do it in a way that activates your muscles more, because I mean, you've developed that skill and it's something that you kind of rely on, but it can totally be a crutch.
Well, and then the strength that you build by doing those movements are directly applicable to doing those movements better. And
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, having the power output as opposed to just strength, because I mean, historically climbing has been way more about strength than it has been about power, just grabbing something small or something bad, locking it off and reaching super far, and that is still applicable, of course, but a lot of it has to do with how quickly can you generate between holds, and then how do you get out of positions using your muscles in a very specific way that is 90% momentum.
totally, I will credit Chris Sharma being the inspiration for me to focus on power versus kind of the static strength of the generation before it. And what I remember being a really young kid, and I competed when I was, like 9 years old, and I would compete in adult categories, and they didn't have a kids category, and so it was not set for kids, and no one cared about adding feet. There was definitely less ideas back then about making it inclusive for all sizes. They could care less, and
Yeah.
I would do stuff like I would hand foot match on like a vertical wall, and it just was ridiculous. Like it was literally like a ridiculous kind of move, but it was literally just the another option that I could think of. And looking back on in hindsight, now it's like, no, sometimes you have to do that on really hard boulders and you have to do these really interesting things. It's like, oh, you want a heel hook over your head? Like, that's silly. It's like, no, that may be what is required on this V14 or something.
Yeah, I think that when you look at Colin Duffy climb, he was much smaller throughout his whole childhood than a lot of his competitors. My brother competed against him in the same category, but I think that one of the things, I mean, aside from his work ethic and a dozen other things, but one thing that probably I imagine helped him out a lot was having to think outside the box and be so creative and fully trust in his ability to break through sequences at his stature. And I think it made him creative and resilient. And I think that those are things that now that he is an adult have probably, I imagine, benefited him a lot.
Yeah, he's pretty good. He's pretty
Yeah,
good.
he's all right.
Okay. Well, yes, now that you have some trips planned to go back outdoors, where are you going? Is there anything that you do have your eye on? So maybe we can get instantiation of an outdoor boulder that has these interesting attributes of complexity and maybe not just a straight crimp that you're attracted to.
I I mean it's again, it's hard to say. It really is harder to tell for me at least. Maybe it's my inexperience, but how difficult a climb is going to be outdoors when you watch a video of someone climbing on a rock. Maybe it's because you can't identify holds that you recognize that are mass produced. Maybe it's because the wall angle you can't really tell. Maybe it's because the person has been working on it for 10 years and finally does the climb. But it is really hard for me to tell what a climb is going to be like. Soon I am going to be going to Bishop and to Vegas. There's a climb I'm eyeing up in Idaho, which honestly is just crimps. So it's not one of the ones that I'm more excited about. And going up in, I think tomorrow to Little Cottonwood for kind of the first time, which is crazy considering I live 20 minutes away. But yeah, I've got my eyes kind of set on a lot of different things. I think right now I'm trying to just expand my horizons as much as possible. I have my eyes on individual climbs, but it's more about the areas and it's more about getting somewhere, looking through the guidebook, looking at what rocks look cool while I'm there. A lot of it has to do with I get somewhere and the feature really inspires me. That happened when I went out a couple weeks ago to the Uintas. There was a climb that Alex had tried before, and I got there. It was called Biceptual. It was a V11, and I got there, and I was like, "This is a really, really cool looking rock, and the moves look fun." And maybe I'm just like a little kid, and I need instant gratification. But I was like, "Fun, good holds." But for me, that's really a lot what it is. If a climb, I look at it from the ground, and I'm like, "Yeah, that looks sick. The holds feel good. It looks fun. It looks dynamic. It looks powerful. It looks like checks all these different boxes." Then maybe I just have a better mindset going into it. Maybe my mind, having talked about mindset this whole time, maybe I need to really work on my outdoor mindset because I that is something I'm completely unfamiliar with. But again, kind of an exciting thing. It just is another frontier of the mindfulness game that I just have yet to explore.
You're going to love Bishop. You're going to love the approaches at the buttermilks too, or the lack thereof. And one little tip for you that I would do sometimes when I had been climbing indoors way more than outdoors for whatever reason is you can look at holds like a crux hold on some climb for you and equate it to a hold indoors and be like, oh, it's like that Technic Scarab or like that Meatlet. And like, I know that hold, like I actually feel pretty solid on this hold and I can do a lot with it. And somehow for me, like channeling, like if this were indoors, this would be a pinch. And actually I love that pinch and I can kind of crush this move. So that's
Ooh,
my
that
little
is
tip for you.
clever.
Little
Yeah, that's
mental
clever.
trick.
I like it.
Last topic, and you kind of hinted at a little bit about some of the stuff you went through, and I don't remember the dates, but you sustained an injury, and I just wanted to talk about a little bit, and maybe you can briefly share about your injury and maybe what you thought brought it on.
Yeah, I mean, I hinted at this earlier when I said that I took a season completely off of competing for I said mental and physical reasons, the physical being the injury. But throughout the first season that I competed back, through 2021 and 2022, I was struggling with an eating disorder that I have talked about in online, and I've been pretty open about recently. But yeah, I was competing a lot and putting a lot of pressure on myself, and that manifested itself as a lot of different things that were very unhealthy for me mentally and, as it turns out, physically. Um, but I think that injuring myself, which happened midway through 2022, while I was actually on the World Cup circuit between World Cups, I was standing on a foothold very statically, not moving, not jumping. I was just standing on a foothold, and I felt a really big crack in my foot. And it turned out that I broke one of my bones. And it is pretty alarming that so little impact, I mean, actually, no impact, so little strain at all, was able to break a bone of mine. And that was a huge wake up call because it realized that my bone density had been pretty severely affected by caloric restriction and low energy availability for years at that point. And yeah, it creeps up on you. It really does. I knew that there was a problem, obviously. I was very well aware of that, but the physical ramifications definitely crept up on me. And I broke my foot. I didn't realize it was broken at first. I kept competing on it, which, I mean, in hindsight was kind of sick, but then it was very very creed of me. But yeah, then I realized that I had a broken foot, and then it turned out I needed surgery, and there were just so many signs, I feel like, from the universe, if you believe in that, that I was not supposed to be competing. It was just my body telling me that I needed a break. And I needed to address, obviously, the root of the injury. It wasn't just about healing the injury, it was like healing kind of like the whole emotional landscape that led to the injury. So that was definitely a very big endeavor, that maybe not as hard as completing my physics degree, but it was pretty hard. And I needed to spend a lot of time, and it felt like I was regressing a lot in a lot of ways. It was one of those things where it's like you lift up your lumpy rug and there's a bunch of shit that you brushed under it, and you're like, wow, now my house is super messy. Do I really wish that I'd done that, or could I just have kept the rug closed? And I swept out my rug, and it took a really long time, and it sucked a lot for a really long time. But then I healed from the injury, and I slowly, I mean, the thing about eating disorders is that the people say that you never really recover from them. And I don't know if that necessarily is true, or if the culture of society is such that everyone, whether not everyone, but most people are thinking about food and thinking about their bodies in a way that isn't always healthy. So maybe it's just that everyone is kind of suffering from some degree along the spectrum of eating disorders. But it took a long time to get to a place where I felt like I could compete again and that I could do it in a healthy way. And that was also one of the reasons why it was so hard to come back, because I didn't know if that was going to be the end of my career, if I was going to come back and I would never be able to do the things that I did before. And that was really, really scary. And that was why that nationals, that first competition back, held the weight that it did, and why I needed to check in with myself to see, do I want to do this? Am I ready for this? And what does it mean to me?
Good job on coming back and just crushing and winning. That's quite a
Yeah, I
comeback.
mean, that definitely helped. That definitely helped, but it was not, that was one of the most difficult comps that I've ever done. And a lot of people wouldn't know that, but man, it was rough in a lot of ways. And I feel like it was a very significant milestone in my life, not because I won, but because I confronted all of these fears that had been building up for so long.
Which is kind of what you're trying to do in general competition, is have these
Yeah,
big
no
challenges.
kidding.
Yeah, I think the tricky stuff about eating versus something like, I don't know, like drug abuse or something, or like, is you have to eat. You don't have to
There's
smoke
no cold
crack.
turkey. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
you can just stop that. And I got to tell you, the one of the reasons why I was so psyched to talk to you is that when I heard you do the other podcast, when I saw your media, there's just something about the way that you articulated and talked about it that not only seem authentic, but also a touch more nuanced versus just this really black and white messaging out there that can be like, you are good or you are bad and you are doing X, and that is inappropriate. And, either you have a eating disorder or you're just, eating McDonald's every day. And just the reality is that's not quite how life works. And so, just maybe you can help me understand the framing you approach now in trying to be the best athlete you can be, while also make sure that you are healthy and able to continue being the best athlete you can be versus suffering injuries or whatever setbacks inappropriate eating habits can manifest as.
Yeah, I mean, that is kind of how I frame that whole experience I went through, is that I learned a lot and I could choose to think of it, I guess, as a traumatic experience. And in some ways, yeah, it was, but also it was a collection of data points where I learned that I cannot sustain that behavior and it is not conducive to performance. It's not just that it was unhealthy for me mentally, it actually made me perform worse because I was putting way more pressure on myself. I was anxious all the time and I wasn't enjoying my sport, which makes me perform worse. But also that I didn't have any power because I was kind of starving myself and I didn't have muscles. Like when I look back on that window of time, a lot of it I don't really remember. And that kind of is contrary to everything we've talked about in this podcast, where I like being super present in what I do and I compete because I enjoy it and I like living so focused in the moment, and I feel like I wasn't able to do any of that. It My brain function was, I feel like, lowered because I just wasn't, everything just felt foggy. I just felt like I was kind of living in this haze where nothing was really that important and nothing really like touched me very emotionally. Um and yeah, it was kind of weird in a lot of ways, but kind of getting to the point, it wasn't beneficial to me and I like people to be aware of that specifically, where it's like, it's not only that I want people to be happy and to be healthy and to have good relationships with food and with their bodies, but at the end of the day, for people who are considering it as an avenue for performance, yeah, losing weight helps you perform a lot in the short term. It's basically like a shortcut to what would otherwise have to be gaining strength, right? But the only issue is that it's a pretty slippery slope, and at a certain point, you might even not recognize once you've passed the apex. I mean, if you were to graph it, there is a pinnacle, and then further, with further weight loss or more prolonged time at that unsustainable weight, you just have lower energy available, and maybe you start losing muscle, and there are ways that you stop performing at the level that you want to, and it isn't helpful. So I couldn't in good faith say that it was, I couldn't say that it wasn't helpful at any point. I couldn't say that because that wouldn't be true. But I also can very honestly say that it, in the long run, made me worse. And I had to do a lot to gain back the strength and the power that I lost because of it. And at this point that I'm at now, I feel so much better at climbing, but I also feel so much more enjoyment from climbing. So there are two sides to that coin.
Yeah, that long-term view is so important because, like I started out the podcast with, you have won nationals in some capacity 8 times, and once is lucky, twice is lucky. All the things I was saying, and that's the thing is, climbing is hard, and you can take shortcuts occasionally. Oftentimes, it doesn't even work, even if you try to take a shortcut. But it's just not quite how you have mastery and success over the long term. And my question for you is, how do you figure out these bounds now that you have more data points? Like, what, if you see someone, or if you were to tell someone like me, like, how do you know when you're heading into a slippery slope, or how do you know when hey, like, Josh, you've been eating cheesecake for the last 10 days. Maybe you should just not eat as much cheesecake. Like, how do you find those guardrails?
It's hard because I feel like intuitive eating is touted so heavily in by nutritionists and kind of like online and social media. And intuitive eating isn't something that everyone can do naturally for starters, and also isn't always the right move for an athlete. When I was talking to my nutritionist, we were talking about how, I mean, maybe when you finish a hard session, you don't feel like eating that much, and you have to. You just have to. In order to get the gains that you want from your session, you need to be eating carbs, you need to be eating protein. And sometimes you don't want to do it, but you just have to. And as an athlete, it is really hard because, yeah, we want to be pushing the limits of our sport. And a lot of sports, climbing is one of them. But I mean, if you look at wrestling or MMA fighting or long distance running, or I don't know, there are countless sports where weight is a factor. Um, it isn't it isn't as easy as saying just eat intuitively. And anyone who says that, I feel like, probably hasn't looked that deeply into the complexities of the sport. And a lot of sports will have a natural weight fluctuation. I mean, for MMA, a lot of people would say that that is one of the more disordered eating sports, but you have to fluctuate your weight. It just is something that is widely accepted. Um, and I do think that in climbing, one of the things that has been an issue on the conversation of eating and disordered eating is, I guess, the lack thereof, the lack of a conversation, the fact that it is seen as taboo. And I think that that doesn't really serve the community because at the end of the day, people are trying to figure these things out for themselves without resources or information or people who have gone through it, gone through similar things to talk to or to look up to. And having that lack of information available, I think, is one of the things that can be the most damaging because either people try and figure it out on their own, or they think that they're going through something alone. So it is hard. It's hard to find the balance, but at the end of the day, I think having that conversation and just having more open discourse within the community probably is the best case scenario in my perspective.
First of all, I got to point out that all sports weight matters. Sometimes it's that you want to gain weight. Sometimes it's that they
Yeah,
need to,
true.
like, I can't think of any sport that doesn't have that. And, don't let me put words in your mouth. But sometimes when I see an athlete like you, I think, wow, Melina's driven. Like, wow, she's doing amazing. She's reading books, listening to podcasts, meditating, trying to do the best she can, actualize your potential. And then to not think that what we eat and the nutrition we have is somehow relevant is just ridiculous. Like, clearly, again, if you just eat nothing but McDonald's and cheesecake, and you gain 50 pounds of fat, that's not going to be conducive to performance in probably any sport except for maybe sumo wrestling. And so I see you trying to be the best you can be, and food and our weight is something that we must understand and pay attention to. And I think that even when I hear the term disordered eating disorder, I feel like it is somehow loaded and paints it as like you are bad because you did X versus like I'm trying to learn how to be the best I can be, and this didn't work out for me, and now I can do something else. And that's why I was talking about these guardrails ideas. So I don't know if, I don't want to say that that's exactly what you're doing because I don't know what you're doing, but I just think taking away that taboo of like, I don't know, eating disorder makes it sound like you're
Yeah,
you're you're
it's like
bad,
a red label that, I mean, that is one of the reasons why I feel like I'm usually kind of more of a private person when it comes to personal struggles and events like that, but I felt compelled to talk about it because there it is taboo, and I do feel like there have historically been these red labels, or there's the notion that people who experience these things can't come back and perform at a high level. And that was something that was also one of the things that I think put the most pressure on me, or maybe it was more internal, but returning to competition when I had been open about my struggles with disordered eating throughout the whole process, and I was mostly scared that I would never be able to come back and do what I had done before. And I mean, obviously, that put more pressure on me than probably anyone else was putting. And I was struggling with that in the sense that I felt like I had to set an example, um, which was one of the things, yeah, that made competition so hard to return to competition because I felt like I had something to prove and I was like trying to say make a statement bigger than myself. Um, at the end of the day, I now on the other side of it, I do feel a lot of pride in that whole process because that was really really difficult to put myself out there at every stage of the process, and that level of transparency is not something that comes naturally to me. um, but yeah, like we've been talking about, it is something that I think just the discourse is really important. And yeah, all sports have a weight element. All sports, at some to some degree, people try to influence their weight up or down. But in climbing, I think historically a lot of people have been, it's always about down and always about sustained down. And I think that if there were even more of a conversation about fluctuations, that, I don't know, I'm not promoting losing weight for climbing, but I do think that a lot of sports have a bulk cut cycle, and climbing completely neglects the bulk side of it. And I think also that's influenced by not having an off season necessarily. I mean, when you're competition climbing, the World Cup season and then the US climbing season sometimes throughout the past few years have been at odds where you don't really have any time off. So it's like, where's the off season? Where is the conditioning portion of the year where I take a step back from on wall stuff and I just lift heavy things in the gym and I eat in a caloric surplus and I put on a ton of muscle? Because for me, that's half of the equation now. I spend time after competitions where I'm lifting a bunch of stuff and I am trying to gain weight. And that is a different mentality than I've ever had before, where I'm trying to put on muscle because I know that that muscle is going to be helpful in the future. Whereas before, I was scared of putting on muscle. I wanted my legs to basically, I wanted them to atrophy because I wanted to have as little weight as possible in the places where I didn't need it. And now I'm doing heavy squats in the gym all the time because I know that in competition climbing, your legs are what propel you up the wall. And it just is a whole paradigm shift about what is going to be an asset. And for me, yeah, it is just looking at the data points. What information can I glean from what I went through? What I learned is that I need more muscle mass. I think that from then till now, I've put on like 10 pounds of muscle mass, and I feel so much lighter when I climb, which is kind of the irony of all of it, right? Is like, you need muscle to get yourself up the wall, and that kind of can be lost sometimes. But yeah, a lot of sports have those fluctuations. Climbing, I just feel like no one really talks about the weight gain portion of that cycle. Like, if you're gonna cut, you also have to do the bulk. I mean, it just, every other sport, it's both. One doesn't come without the other. Even in like bodybuilding, which is like, how lean can you get? It's like they are all bulking a ton before that, you know? I don't know. It's a hard subject. It's really touchy, but at the end of the day, you have to, I don't know, you have to do what is right for you. And I think for me, it just isn't worth it even to go down that path.
Well, it really connects to that auto regulation we were talking about, even just with the mental thing and hyping yourself up. It's like really knowing your body, really knowing what you need and not what others need, but what you need, and then being able to appropriately do it. And I just gotta say that I didn't think about that for your that comp. That was a that was a lot on your shoulders, I bet, and it must have felt great coming out, on
Yeah.
top, because you probably held a lot on your shoulders before going into it, and that idea of weight loss being a potential shortcut, but not being something that works over the long term, I don't blame you for being like, okay, like, well, who am I now? Like, who am I now?
Yeah,
And you
and I
showed up.
wanted to I wanted to also show, not I don't think that having an eating disorder discredits anyone, for the record. But I also did want to show that I was as good of a climber regardless, and that I wasn't only successful because I was late, and that I could go through the steps. I didn't need the shortcut, that I could be just as good if I took the long road, if I gained the strength, if I put the time in. And it's not that I felt like I was cheating myself, but I wanted to prove that through both avenues, I was equally capable.
Well, not just that. Now you can keep on doing it again and again and again,
Yeah, way
and
more
that's
sustainable.
that's
Yeah.
more fun. And that's why and again, I don't want to put words in your mouth or feelings in you, but I looked at it as, again, you are ambitious, you try hard, you maximize everything, and you're pulling different levers and variables and finding out what works. And it's not always clear what works, and sometimes you listen to the wrong song to hype you up too much, or whatever the case may be. And so, I guess, again, I kind of want to adjust that language and the intensity around some of the words that we use. And I feel like it just paints people. It's like, you are bad because of X. And it's just like, it's not a nuanced conversation. It doesn't help people to make things so black and white. And cause like, so where do I go from that? Like, so you guys paint me as bad. Okay. Am I good now? Like, am I just, was I bad then? I'm good now. And it's a cycle that we all go through. So I appreciate you sharing your journey, and being nuanced about it, open about it, and adding to the discourse instead of just painting people in a box one way or another, because that is not helpful, and it's kind of mean, to be
Yeah,
honest.
I mean, yeah, and I mean, I couldn't say anything about someone who is struggling with that other than that I don't know, I really hope that everyone is able to like find their own peace. And I don't think that it discredits anything, but at the same time, I do hope that people are able to have more longevity, and that people are able to get to a point where I like never thought I would be able to be where I'm at now in my relationship with food. Um, and it took a lot of time and a lot of really hard work with professionals and by myself and with my friends and with my family. And I'm lucky to have the support system that I do. But yeah, I hope that anyone who is struggling with it recognizes that no, yeah, it doesn't make you bad, or it isn't something shameful, because there is a lot of shame that comes along with that label. But also that there is another side to it, and at the end of the tunnel, I mean, who knows how long the tunnel is realistically? It could be an infinite tunnel. It's not start to finish. There's just always it's always happening. Life is always happening. But I don't know, there is another way to do it that is more sustainable, and I hope people are able to find that within themselves, and get support in the ways that they need.
All right, Melina, that was intense.
Yeah.
It's stuff like this has to get addressed. And I appreciate you sharing, but it's intense. And thank you. Thanks for sharing. And let's put a pin in that topic. And I'm going to ask you my classic question, which is, Malia, how do you go from good to great?
This is one that I've been thinking about, but also one that I think just I have had to learn over time. I think I always put a metric on success that was just placement grades. It's hard to, I don't know, it's really hard to take a step back and say, what were the processes that created those outcomes? And for me, that really boils down to effort, and not just effort in the moment, but sustained effort over time. Effort, resilience, especially because a lot of times it's hard to put in effort consistently over time. It's hard to put yourself out there. It's really vulnerable to be doing anything at the limit of your ability to be 100% comfortable with failure, to put that try hard face on, and to know that you could be doing your absolute most and still not reach your goals, whether that be in training, in practice, or outdoors. Um, so I think effort, I think resilience, being able to do that time and time again, being able to put yourself out there and be vulnerable time and time again, that, and a little bit what we were talking before, scrappiness. I think that the best people know that the first time you do anything, it's not going to look beautiful. It's not going to look perfect. Kind of abandoning the need for perfection and being willing to do whatever it takes in a given moment. You can always go back, you can always do it again, you can always do it better, you can always do it cleaner. And everyone who does it cleaner has done something like it scrappier at first, which is also something that you need to recognize. And I know that's three things. I know that is that wasn't one thing that makes or makes you stand out or not stand out. But I mean, I do think that it is more complex than that. I think it's showing up. I think it's putting everything you have out there and knowing that it doesn't have to look perfect, that it can look terrible, it can look awful, it can be as far from perfect as, I don't know, it can be just absolute garbage climbing sometimes, but that is a necessary step on the path to greatness. You can't do it perfectly the first time, but you have to do it. You have to try it, and you have to be willing to not do it and then show up the next day and try again.
That's total kid style. That just, I'm just going to
Yeah.
do it.
Yeah, kids, sometimes you watch them and you're like, that is literally the most disgusting climbing I've ever seen in my life. Have you ever, like, do you even have awareness that your feet are like part of your body? And then they do it again and it's like, wow, that like still kind of sucks. But over and over and over again, they come into the gym and they do the same climb over and over and over again. And it's like, how are you not bored? But it's because it's not about the sending of the climb, it's about the learning of the movement. It's about pushing your body to its limit and then fine tuning. Because if you aren't pushing yourself, if you aren't doing things at your limit, you're just putting a cap on what you're able to accomplish.
I have a couple of young kids, and something that I see that's really interesting is that they want to read the same story over and over and over again. And the truth is they often won't understand it. Everyone has a little bit of a stretch goal, like, and my daughter will ask me, like, what does that word mean? But she'll kind of get the gist of the Cinderella story, or reading the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So it's that
Cute. Uh-huh.
Narnia series, and we're reading this full book multiple times, and it's just interesting that she just wants to keep on showing up, listening to it, trying to understand what's going on. And it makes me think of my practice, where sometimes I'll climb something that's not that hard for me in the gym. Maybe I'm warming up, and I will focus on making it beautiful. And at first, that sounds really good. It's like, oh, like make this climb elegant and beautiful. But what I often find I'm doing is I'm overpowering it to make it look beautiful. And people will look at me and think, oh, that's cool. Like, good job, Josh. But I feel like I'm doing myself a disservice there, where I'm not really trying to learn what my body is intuiting from the moves. I'm kind of just showing it like, oh, I can crush this move and make it look beautiful. And there's just something about showing up again and again, and with honesty, instead of kind of like this different mentality of overpowering that kids often don't struggle with.
Yeah, it's being willing to do the same thing. And also, people, I think, are afraid of unsending something. That is a term that I've heard recently where it's like, I did it, but then I didn't do it. And now suddenly I haven't, I feel like it negated the doing it, which I don't believe in. But it's the willingness to not be successful at something you already have succeeded in that I think is kind of like the crux of it. It's that you don't win a comp and then retire because you want a 1-0 record, You keep showing up because that's how you get better and that's how you get experience. There's a Bruce Lee quote, I think, that is like, I fear not the man who's done 1,000 different kicks one time, but the man who's done one kick 1,000 times. And that is kind of what it boils down to, being willing to do the dirty work, to do the same thing a bunch of different times, trying to get everything that you can out of it, trying to master the craft. And that comes with having I mean, you can't really do that without having an obsession with the craft to begin with. But yeah, it comes down to like, are you going to show up? Are you going to put the same amount of effort into something you've maybe already done, or you've done something very similar, or it's not the grade that you are chasing, but it's something that is going to be in a different style that's going to improve you or in your skills. I don't know. It's just about putting yourself in situations that are uncomfortable and that push you to be a better version of yourself and putting 100% effort in every single time.
Freaking love that Bruce Lee quote. I use it all the time too. I just want to echo the resilience thing really quick because you likened it to effort and it's like effort over a sustained period. And it's something that I've always struggled with where I'm really good at trying hard in the moment. Like I know how to really, sometimes I try so hard I hurt myself.
Yeah.
I really know how to try hard. But what's also difficult is okay, I have my first kid and I'm staying up until 2 in the morning. And I'm not climbing much, and then you come back and you're like, I don't feel good. I haven't climbed in a few months. Maybe I hurt myself. Whatever the case, maybe whatever setback you have, you show up and you're like, I was trying so hard and now I just don't feel good. And just the willingness to keep showing up and just saying, who knows what the future holds? Like, who knows?
Yeah, taking time off, that's real. I when I was recovering from injury, I remember coming back to the gym and I could barely do 6 consecutive pull-ups. And I was wearing this gigantic leg brace and I was like, this thing must weigh 20 pounds. And then I weighed it and it was 2 pounds. It was two. And I was floored. I was so upset by that discovery. But yeah, it was about, I am not in a place that I've been before. This is a completely different, I just have done all these things before. I'm not pushing PRs. I'm barely like scraping by what I was able to do, I don't know, when I was a youth climber. And it can be so disheartening, and that's where the resilience comes in. It's like, am I putting 100% of my effort into doing 7 pull-ups in a row? Yeah, I am. And does that feel not that great? Yeah, it doesn't feel good, but you just got to do it, because otherwise you, what's the alternative? Mediocrity? I don't know.
Fuck that.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a good point to end on. Melina Costanza, lots of bombs were dropped. Thank you. That was
Yeah,
really
fortunately
fun.
none outdoors though.
Who knows? Last time you didn't even notice. So,
That's true.
and Alex thought it was an earthquake. So, okay, that was really fun. I appreciate that deep dive into mental training, and I wish you luck on unhating nature. And yeah, looking forward to seeing what projects you do get on in Bishop. But stay away from the swarm. It's dangerous. It's a little bit of a sinkhole.
I've heard it can really trap you in there. Yeah, thank you so much. I will be, next time you see me, I'll be a pioneer of the great outdoors.
Sounds good. I'll hold you to it. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like even more content, go to patreon.com/testpiece. And while you're at it, share this podcast with someone you know who would love it. And please leave us a review or rating at wherever you get your podcasts. We've also got tons of great content on YouTube and Instagram, so don't forget to like and subscribe there. Okay, see you next week.